Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our talk entitled Gathering Stories, Envisioning Equity Towards a Peace Church Where Women in Ministry Thrive. I'm Amy Zimbelman. I'm the Conference Minister of Mountain States, so I serve the churches in Colorado and New Mexico. This has been a 3/4 time position. The other quarter of my time, I've been working on this research project for the last 18 months, which began for me through a grant from the Louisville Institute. And then most of the rest of my time, I am the parent to 2 young children, one of whom just turned 6 this week, with my husband. So after I started my project, I heard through the grapevine, the Mennonite grapevine and the Duke alumni grapevine, that Elizabeth Johnson, this person I never heard of, was working on a similar topic. And so we connected and have been partnering on this for the whole time. And we ended up getting funding from Duke's Sociology Department, MCUSA's Women in Leadership Ministry, shout out to the folks here today, and the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, also known as SSSR. So I'll let Elizabeth introduce herself.
Okay, hey everyone, my name is Elizabeth Johnson, and I'm a PhD candidate at Duke University. I'm also a member of Raleigh Mennonite Church, and am coming up on the 2nd anniversary of my baptism next month. Yeah, very exciting. And before I got baptized, I was a medical sociologist, and then after my baptism, God very quickly gave me a new assignment. I got involved in this research because I was interested in supporting clergywomen and exploring the puzzle that I heard about from my pastor friends, where clergywomen are simultaneously in a position of power and yet are often the targets of harassment and abuse even from congregants. And it turns out that when you start doing enough interviews about something, it just sort of becomes your dissertation. So this is my dissertation research now. I work with my advisor, Dr. Mark Chaves, who runs the National Congregation Study. And also I work with Dr. Nancy Ammerman. So if anyone has read a lot of sociology of religion, you might know those names and know that the work that I'm sharing today is being held to a terrifyingly high standard of academic rigor. And I'm really excited to share it with you because I've gotten to share this at conferences, but it means a lot more and it's a much bigger honor to get to share it with the community that has a stake in this work. So thanks for having me.
So the question that I came to for this research is, what are the experiences of women who have served in ministry in MCUSA settings? And how can their stories help us create cultures and institutions where all leaders thrive? So they say that all research is to some degree me-search. The desire to research this topic came out of my experience of, unfortunately, prolonged mistreatment, including abuse, when I was pastoring. When I left that church, my husband and I thought, maybe I'll never pastor again. But then soon thereafter, got the call to apply to be the conference minister, and I'm coming up on 3 years in this role. And I can say it's been the most meaningful and fulfilling work I've ever done, even with its many challenges. But I was hearing these rumors that women were leaving ministry, and I wondered, okay, what are their experiences? And can we transform some of the negative ones that I know, unfortunately, can happen into more positive ones that I also very much know can happen? So I've ended up taking the role of asking hard questions from within a church that I love very deeply, and hopefully we can do life together with even more kindness and justice. But before we get too far, we do have a few things that are foundations for our research and invitations that we have for you today. So first, we are building on the foundational understanding that women can and should be pastors. This is because the founder of our faith, Jesus, called women to preach, respected women as equals, supported women, was financially supported by women, etc., etc., etc. I don't need to convince most of you of that. And the predecessor to our denomination, of course, General Conference, has ordained women for almost half a century. Next year is 50 years, so we should throw a party for that, I think. Second, we invite you to come to this seminar with as much openness as you can muster. So this research focuses on a marginalized group, women in ministry, and so we invite you to feel challenged or uncomfortable, especially if you don't belong to this group. If you find yourself asking, well, what about this other group? Or is it really that bad? We ask that you would kind of set that aside for now and try to take this presentation on its own terms, and then we will welcome conversation and feedback at the end.
And finally, we invite you to step out if necessary to take care of yourself. This presentation includes potentially triggering content about sexism and violence against women, including stalking and sexualized violence. So please feel free to step out of the room for a bit if necessary to care for your well-being. So because this presentation is the culmination of an almost 2-year-long research project, the seminar might be slightly less interactive than many of the ones at MenoCon this year. But there will be time for that, and there will be time for questions at the end. And we're going to be sharing some really practical tips based on our research for what you can do to help support the women in ministry in your life. In our presentation today, we'll share a little bit about our research methods before moving into key findings, these next steps you can take, and then a Q&A portion. We ask that you hold questions until the end, but don't hold them in your head. Hold them on a piece of paper in front of you. We will be going around, and we have some members of Women in Leadership Ministry who are going to be going around and collecting those and moderating the discussion after this presentation. So feel free to write those down as they come up and just hang on to them until then. So without further ado, research methods. To start off with, I'll just give you the size of the population we're talking about. This graph includes all the active licensed clergy in the MCUSA database by gender. And as you can see, there are almost twice as many active licensed men in ministry as women in ministry, who are a little under 35% of the total of active licensed clergy. So these 329 clergywomen are in the minority within MCUSA today, which remains a male-dominated workplace. And this inequality continues to be present if we dial down into specific ministry roles, where women are underrepresented in roles like lead pastor and overrepresented in the roles that often come with less power and prestige, like associate pastor. I'll let Amy tell you about our qualitative methods.
So I took the lead on qualitative interviews, which lasted 1 to 2 hours each. And the one-on-one interviews covered around 15 topics, from what was your call to ministry, to how decisions are made in your church, in other words, how does power work, to your hopes for the future. And you'll see when we quote, there we go. You'll see when we quote from the interviews today that we guaranteed strict confidentiality, so the names and certain identifying information has been redacted. This enabled study participants to be very candid. They didn't have to worry that if they spoke out against their employer, they might hurt relationships or be blacklisted for future employment. So the 28 participants included 18 current pastors, 10 former pastors who have left ministry. Pastors from every MCUSA conference are represented in the qualitative interviews. I will say that for Mountain States, I interviewed someone who was part of Rocky Mountain Conference before it was Mountain States, so kind of a historical person in my conference, so that there wasn't a conflict of interest. We had 6 decades represented, so our youngest participant was 31 and our oldest was 91. And we paid a lot of attention to intersectionality, so we overrepresented lesbian, bisexual, and BIPOC women compared to the denomination as a whole. We are keenly aware that having multiple marginalized identities compounds mistreatment. It can be exponentially more. And so we wanted to make sure that those voices were really well represented. And I can say their experiences were quite unique.
Okay, the quantitative side of this research comes from the Supporting Pastors Survey, which is a new survey questionnaire designed for this project based on our findings from interviews. This is a nationally representative survey that was sent to a random sample of active, licensed MCUSA clergy serving in congregational ministry. We stratified our sample by gender and sent the survey to a higher proportion of women than men because women are underrepresented in the database. And the Supporting Pastor Survey is a web-based survey programmed using Qualtrics, which we did on purpose because prior research shows that people are much more comfortable reporting sensitive information in a web-based survey format. And a lot of the questions that we asked people were pretty sensitive. This design also allowed us to have the survey branch off and give people different follow-up questions based on different experiences that they had had. These experiences were drawn from what we learned in interviews, as well as multiple rounds of pre-testing with men and women in ministry across the United States. The final survey questionnaire asks about everything from job satisfaction and health to experiences of harm to characteristics of the respondent and their congregation, which can help us understand which clergy in which settings are most at risk. The survey takes about 15 to 30 minutes to complete. The current response rate of our survey, which has been out for less than a month, so this is hot off the presses, is 39.5%. So if you are part of the 60.5% of sampled pastors who have it in their inboxes, please go ahead and take that.
It's not spam.
The research is counting on you. Please go ahead and do that. And even though we are still collecting responses right now, the most recent comparable survey of men and women in Mennonite ministry in MCUSA and MC Canada, conducted in 2005, had a final response rate of 34%. So we feel pretty good about sharing our early findings with you today. So the reason that we do mixed methods research rather than picking one technique is because using both qualitative and quantitative techniques allows us to learn different things from different research methods. The qualitative interviews allow us to get an in-depth, specific understanding of women's experiences and understand the processes that shape these experiences. The national survey, on the other hand, allows us to develop a broad, generalizable understanding of clergy experiences across the denomination. So by combining these, we get the fullest possible picture.
And I do want to name that we have put in a lot of work, and therefore we have a ton of data. So for my qualitative side of things, we have 350,000 words approximately, which is kind of 3 to 4 big novels worth. And then on the quantitative side, we have 236 observations, 577 variables. Of course, now it might be a little more. And Elizabeth here has written thousands of lines of code to analyze this data. So we will be sharing only a tiny part of what we have gathered from all this, and we hope to publish as we go. So you'll have an opportunity at the end to sign up to receive more information about all of this as we move forward. So today I want to bring your attention to a few themes that emerged from this research that we find important. And one theme is that many women in ministry report that their work is meaningful, powerful, and distinctly vulnerable. And so the first of these 3 themes we'll focus on right now is that many women find their work meaningful. Well, what do I mean by that? Here's a quote from one of the women. "I absolutely adore being a pastor. I really do think it is the greatest gift that God has called us to, that people allow us to walk with them from birth to death and share very intimate pieces of their lives with us." Another participant said, well, I asked, if you could talk to your past self before you went into ministry, what would you say to her? I'll note that she's now retired. She said, oh, it's going to be so much better than you ever imagined.
The results from the survey suggest that in addition to finding their ministry meaningful, most pastors find their job satisfying as well. It often seems from conversation in the news right now that pastors are miserable. But this graph shows that most pastors in MCUSA are moderately or very satisfied with their jobs. There's no statistically significant difference in job satisfaction between men and women. Statistically significant is a word I'll be using a lot during this presentation, and all it means is that a relationship is probably not due to random chance. So in this case, because there's not a significant difference, any differences you see in the graph are probably just random chance and not an actual difference by gender in job satisfaction. But most of the findings I'll be sharing will be statistically significant. I want to name now that most of the graphs I'll be sharing today are limited to men and women. This is because there are no openly trans pastors in MCUSA right now. We do have one non-binary survey respondent, but I'm not including a non-binary category in these graphs because that would just be one person's opinion. And that person did not sign up for me to expose their opinions like that. But back to this graph, this is showing results from people who are currently in congregational ministry, so it isn't taking into account those who have left ministry. Some of those stories are captured in our qualitative interviews, including stories from people who were not satisfied at all by their work experiences.
So the next one is many women in ministry report that their work is powerful. And by this, let me explain what I mean. It just means that the job itself has the power to change hearts and minds. So let me read this quote, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So a man who had not been affirming of women in ministry came down to my office, and he sat down and he said, "Participant, I just have to tell you that I was wrong about women in leadership," he said. "I've never had it modeled for me, and it was easier to make assumptions about the scripture, about women, because it fit what I had experienced. I can no longer do that, and you're teaching me that women are leaders." Another woman said, "There was a pastor in our conference who spoke out publicly against my having been credentialed. Years later, he wrote me a letter and apologized. He just realized what he had done and said, 'I'm sorry.' He had also had 8 years of watching me. I wasn't trying to change anyone's opinion, that's what I say. So almost a third of the women that I interviewed had stories like this of people changing their minds about women in ministry. And what's funny is I wasn't specifically asking about that. It just came up in the course of the interview. In addition to this, there were various stories of challenging institutions or norms. So, for example, quite a few stories of our congregation as a whole doesn't believe in women in ministry, but we're going to make an exception and hire you. The next thing we found is that being a woman in ministry is distinctly vulnerable. The profession of being a pastor, on the whole, is a vulnerable profession. And here's what I mean. Anyone off the street can walk into a church and have almost instant access to a pastor's workplace, their family, including their children, much of their social life, their social media, etc. There are very few built-in boundaries. And in fact, a pastor is often expected to invite congregants to their house, unlike other helping professions, right? Like doctors, teachers, therapists. For them, it would probably be frowned upon. Well, this builds trust quickly so pastors can do their jobs, but it makes a pastor distinctly open to the possibility of harm. And then so that's for any pastor, regardless of gender, and then any historical marginalization, such as being female, only compounds that. So let me read some quotes about that, what that's like for women. I thought that being pastoral meant I just had to listen while we were bullied and harassed. I think this is something that we do to pastors. We groom them for abuse because we tell them that they should just expect that their congregations will treat them badly, and it's like a big joke that we all share with each other. As pastors, we have power, and as women, we are vulnerable.
One vulnerable experience that pastors, especially women in ministry, are particularly likely to encounter is sexual harassment. As this graph shows, over 17% of women in ministry with MCUSA report having been sexually harassed over the course of their ministry careers, compared to only 5.68% of men. This is the difference from around 1 in 5 to around 1 in 20. And this difference is statistically significant, so it's probably not due to random chance. These numbers are almost identical to what they were 18 years ago in the 2005 survey of MCUSA and MC Canada, where 17.6% of women and 6.3% of men reported having been harassed. These numbers also may disguise the extent of some of the challenges that clergy face, because some incidents are hard to categorize as being sexual harassment or not. As this pastor memorably summarized, this is why sexism is so hard, because it's not like someone's like, hey, I love the way your boobs look, you know? But someone says, oh, that's a great fit of your t-shirt. And you're just like, wait, what? I don't know, am I crazy? It's always so subtle that you can't quite put your finger on it. So to capture these gray area experiences, which is what this pastor called them, we also gave pastors the opportunity to say that they were not sure whether they had ever been sexually harassed. And once again, we see it's a substantial and statistically significant difference here. Almost 13% of clergy women aren't sure whether they have been sexually harassed or not during their ministry careers, compared with only 2.27% of men. When we add this together, we learn that about 30% of women in congregational ministry at MCUSA have either been sexually harassed or have a gray area experience that might constitute harassment. That's almost 1 in 3. In addition to gray area experiences, another problem with measuring sexual harassment in surveys is that people differ in what behaviors they define as harassment. The best way to handle this as a researcher is to ask people about specific experiences and behaviors. So that is what we did. There's going to be a lot of text on this slide, and I don't expect you to read all of it. There is not a quiz at the end. The key takeaway here in this first column is that the specific experiences we asked people about that we thought related to sexual harassment and coercion range from everything from crude or offensive remarks to sexual assault. This section was based on previous surveys of workplace harassment, including, ironically, one from the Department of Defense. Additionally, we knew from interviews that sexual harassment isn't the only challenge that women in ministry face. So we expanded on previous surveys of workplace harassment by adding a section about other forms of sexism women in ministry experience, which include things like being condescended to or being mistaken for a pastor's spouse, a secretary, or another non-pastor role. Finally, we also knew that some experiences of harm clergy women face aren't really directly linked to gender at all. So we also asked about things like having one's salary withheld, receiving bullying messages, having one's credentials unfairly impeded or revoked, being physically attacked, or being threatened with retaliation for whistleblowing. We were interested in knowing about how common these experiences were for men and women too. This graph shows the top 5 most common forms of harm MCUSA clergy women have faced while acting in their capacity as a pastor over the course of their careers. I included the percentage of men who experienced them as well for comparison. The most common experience being put down, slighted, ignored, or otherwise condescended to was almost ubiquitous, having been experienced by almost 95% of women and over 85% of men. There is a large and statistically significant difference in the next most common item, which was being mistaken for not being a pastor. The knowing laughter suggests that that statistic of over 70% of women having had that experience compared to less than 20% of men is maybe true in this room as well. Inappropriate remarks about one's appearance or voice were common for both men and women, as well as receiving harmful or intimidating communications. And finally, there was a statistically significant difference in the 5th most common form of harm for women, which was being overtly criticized for not conforming to gender stereotypes, which was an experience that women were about twice as likely to have had as men. While they're not in the top 5, 2 other experiences were significantly more common for women in ministry than for men. And these were being drawn into unwanted discussion of sexual matters and receiving unwanted or uncomfortable touch. Both of these were around twice as common for women as for men, and have been experienced by 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 clergy women over the course of their careers. So that's a pretty substantial number.
Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of audience participation. Here's the question, and women in leadership folks have heard this already, so you're not allowed to answer. What is the single biggest predictor of sexual harassment in the workplace? So in other words, if you had 2 organizations and you wanted to try to predict over the next year which one is going to have more, not reports of sexual harassment, but actual incidents of sexual harassment, what would be the first thing that you look at? I want people to shout out ideas.
The ratio of males to females.
Okay, great. That's a great guess, and that's one of the top 3, but it's not the top 1.
Religion?
Religion? Ooh, I don't know how that factors in. It's a good guess.
Power.
Power? What do you mean by that?
So practices around power, like how decisions are made, who has the power, how it's exercised.
Okay, yes. How hierarchical an organization is one of the top 3. So those are 2 and 3 are the ones you mentioned. Does anyone know the top one? I love this. Let's get it.
Whether the leader, I can't think of how to put this right. Who the leader is in terms of, I don't know if it would be appropriate to say sexual orientation, but whether or not the leader is male or female.
Yeah, so that would be one of, the makeup, of just leadership. Yeah, I think that does factor into it. That's not the top one though. Okay, I'm gonna tell you, I'm not gonna let you keep guessing all day. Okay, the single biggest predictor of sexual harassment on the job is how permissive an organization is of this conduct. So, this somewhat goes without saying, right? And yet, that's what it comes down to. Let me give an example. Let me read a quote of what this might look like. So when reporting mistreatment, this participant said, the response I got from other women in ministry was, yes, I've been through something like that. There were a few older women whose response was just like, well, that's just a part of it. That's just the dues we pay. That's just being a woman in ministry. I wouldn't say they were dismissive of me per se, but they were just like, yeah, it happens, and now it's happened to you. As though I were a rugby player and had broken my leg for the first time. It's not that they were insensitive to the fact that my leg was broken. They were just like, well, yeah, you play rugby. Your leg's going to get broken. You have gone through this rite of passage, as have we all. Right? So this participant is describing an environment as violent as a rugby game, incredibly unsafe in her workplace, and the response from someone older is not, wow, that's not okay, we need to do something about this, right? The response is, yep, sounds about right. So through that response, they're helping to normalize a culture that accepts mistreatment, right? And according to the studies, that is the best way to usher in more mistreatment to your organization, because folks who mistreat others, unfortunately, thrive in that type of permissive environment. So what we're going to do now is give a couple examples of what support can look like and what it looks like when it's absent at various levels in our church lives together. So support at the local congregational level. I'm going to read a quote of what that can look like to have support there. And this quote is after the participant reported sexual harassment. It was really helpful to be on such a strong leadership team who so quickly came around and was like, no, we are stopping this and taking the pastor out of the situation of sexual harassment. And we are going to respond to him, the offender. It really matters to have good, strong support people in your congregation. And if you don't have that and something like that happens, that's when it could unravel.
An example of what lack of support looks like is a quote from another interview participant who said, "Pastors need pastors, and I didn't feel like we had a person that was always assigned to us. I always felt like I could have used someone there for listening and walking with us a little closer, because I never realized how lonely the pastoral position could be. When you're trying to hold people's stuff in confidentiality, I was burned out." So as this second pastor highlighted, having a person assigned to you can be very helpful in managing the demands of the pastoral career. Having a liaison or pastor-congregant relations team is one of the things that we asked about in our survey because we thought it might be related to experiencing harm. And interestingly, it is, for women and not for men. This graph shows the average harms over the past 12 months experienced by men and women with and without a liaison or PCRT. This is the average of the sum of all of those harm experiences on that big list from a few slides ago, so it could be anywhere from 0 to 18. For this graph and the upcoming graphs, I'm looking only at harms that have happened in the past 12 months because we know that pastors change congregations and change conferences and change positions. So we're focusing on just the past year. And I need to be able to hold both a clicker and a script. So what this tells us is that having a liaison is associated with experiencing significantly fewer harms in the past year for women compared to women who don't have a liaison. And this is a statistically significant association. However, there is no significant relationship between having a liaison and recent harm outcomes for men. Correlation doesn't always equal causation, so this doesn't prove that a liaison causes women to have better experiences in the workplace. It could also be true that there's something else about the kind of congregation that has a liaison that helps to protect women. However, a good liaison, or PCRT, has come up in interviews as something that is helpful for clergy women. And currently, 37.9% of clergy women do not have a liaison or PCRT. So that means that they are over here on the tall side of the graph, which is where we do not want them to be. So if you attend a local church that does not have this support in place for pastors, especially if you have a woman as pastor, this might be a great change to make to better support women in ministry in your congregation. As this next graph shows, women in our study who are on a staff with multiple pastors, but no other women, have significantly higher average number of harms in the past year than women on multi-pastor teams who have at least one other female pastor on staff. So having at least one other female pastor around appears to be beneficial compared to working only with men. Right now, 55.9% of clergy women who are part of a pastoral team don't have any female co-pastors. So the majority of clergy women are, again, on the tall side of this graph. And I don't have a graph for it because I'm not trying to throw scatter plots at y'all at 9 a.m. But when we control for congregation size by holding it constant, having another clergy woman on staff also seems to reduce harm for women compared to being the only pastor at all. I'm not sharing this information to shame churches that can only have one pastor for size or budget reasons, or that choose to have a gender-balanced pastoral team. I'm also not sharing this to discourage churches from hiring only one female pastor if they're only hiring one pastor at a given time. You can hire a woman, even if that means she'll be the only woman. Women are not gerbils. You don't need two of them so they can socialize with each other. However, if you are in a position of hiring multiple pastors, there is an added benefit to having multiple women on your pastoral staff in terms of making a safe environment for clergy women. Finally, I don't have graphs about all of this, but there are some other aspects of how a congregation functions that we looked at in the survey that are starting to become significant for both women and men as results come in. The short version of this is that congregations that their pastors see as healthy, even in ways that are completely unrelated to gender, seem less likely to harm their leaders. This means congregations where pastors say that people get along with one another, that decision-making power is allocated fairly, that congregants are helpful to pastors, and pastors feel empowered to make their vision for the congregation a reality. Having a healthy and functioning congregation doesn't just help attract and retain church members, it helps protect leaders from harm too. You can't have a healthy leader in a sick congregation. So it's important to look beyond the specific factors like liaisons to also the broader ways that a congregation is functioning and how those can help or harm clergy of all genders.
So now we want to read another quote of what support and lack of support can look like at the conference or middle judicatory level. So here's a quote. "I did tell the conference minister, if I don't have a sabbatical, I'm gonna quit. And so he was like, okay, you're having a sabbatical. I told him and he helped. The conference actually hired someone to work instead of us, the church, paying someone. So those are supports."
On the other hand, a lack of support could look like this respondent story. "When I got sexually harassed by a congregant, I ended up telling both the conference minister about that and my spiritual counsel, which is sort of like a pastor-congregation relations team. And both of them were like, wow, he's agreed, that sucks. Maybe you should wear more modest clothing." Yeah, and I will call your attention to the fact that this first quote is from a current pastor, and this one is from a former pastor who is no longer in ministry with MCUSA. So as these quotes suggest, conference ministers have a huge role to play in how things turn out for clergywomen. And I say the word clergywomen deliberately because our survey results suggest that conference ministers may play an even more influential role for women than for men. We asked pastors whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement, "The conference minister who knows my work best can be relied on when things get tough in my job." There is a statistically significant relationship for women here, as shown in this graph, wherein people who disagreed with that statement also tended to have experienced a greater number of harms in the past 12 months. And this isn't true for men, where this relationship looks much more random. As a reminder, correlation doesn't equal causation. So perhaps clergywomen with less trust in their conference ministers tend to experience greater harm, or maybe experiencing greater harm leads clergywomen to lose trust in their conference ministers to have their backs. But either way, this represents an important opportunity for conference ministers to intervene and improve gender equity by forming positive, trustworthy, supportive, reliable relationships with the pastors in their conference. Right now, 20% of clergywomen do not agree that their conference minister can be relied on when things get tough, which is about 1 in 5 women in ministry. So it is really important and urgent to build these relationships. Another conference level factor that was significant for women, but not for men, was pastors' perception of whether women are adequately represented in leadership in their conference. For clergy women, disagreeing with this was associated with having experienced a greater number of harms, while again, no such relationship exists for men. I don't think it's likely that experiencing more harms leads a pastor to believe there are fewer women in leadership in her conference. So this suggests that it maybe is important to make sure that women are represented in leadership at not just the congregation, but also the conference level. And currently, 12.6% of clergy women, so more than 1 in 10, do not feel like this is the case. And finally, there's one last really interesting relationship that I want to share with you that I think is important to know about whether you're at the congregation or the conference level, and that is the role of ordination. As this graph shows, there is a statistically significant relationship between being licensed and seeking ordination, that's this middle section right here, and experiencing greater harm compared to people who are licensed but not seeking ordination or people who are already ordained, which are the majority of pastors. This is statistically significant for women, but not for men. Even though we can see that relationship there a little bit, it's not a big enough difference to be statistically significant yet. This relationship can't just be explained away by age, the length of one's career, or the length of time one has spent in their current position, all of which are also associated with experiencing less harassment over time. This relationship still exists even if we control for those factors. So I believe that the reason that this is the case is because ordination is often a very stressful process that gives a lot of people power over the person being ordained. And whenever you have a situation where someone has power over another person, there is the potential for that power to be abused. We've heard in interviews about conferences, conference ministers, and lead pastors impeding people's ordinations, and these experiences are sometimes among the most stressful moments of a clergywoman's career. So if you are a leader who has a role in deciding whether or not someone gets to be ordained, Our research suggests that you should please be aware of the harms that can occur in that process, and please use your power responsibly and don't make people jump through hoops unfairly. And if you aren't in a position where you have control over whether this happens, just be aware that that part of a pastor's career can be particularly stressful and risky. So you might think that this is a small number of pastors because the ordination process is like a temporary liminal stage. But so far, 11.5% of the clergywomen who've taken our survey are currently licensed and seeking ordination. So this means that, based on our survey, more than 1 in 10 clergywomen fall into this group. So the survey results I shared today suggest that support at the congregation and conference level is important and matters for women. However, when Amy asked pastors in interviews about the formal systems there to support them, a very common response was laughter. Pastors reported things like, the support I got was what I put into place. I formed my own support systems. That's been the biggest lack, not just currently, but historically. There has never been a lot of support. And it was not conference provided, it was networks and relationships that we as female clergy nurtured or looked for ourselves. These quotes are from 4 different women, and this is not comprehensive. We have a lot more, but there's only so many quotes you could fit on a slide. So despite how important support is, there is a real sense among clergy women that support is lacking and has been for a long time, and this has consequences.
So the title of this slide is Consequences of the Failure to Support Clergy Women. It could also be named The Stories That Keep Amy Up at Night. When there's not enough support, the worst can happen. I want to give a few examples of this before reading a quote that's going to come up. So one participant talked about being stalked for months by a fellow church leader, the church chair, while she was pastoring. He was married, but showing up at night, demanding sex from her. She got a restraining order against him from the police, but it took about a decade for her to share those events with other church leaders. So the church didn't prevent it, they didn't protect her when it was happening, and she didn't feel safe to share about it for a long time afterwards. Or unfortunately, there were multiple stories of female pastors standing up against sexual abuse, and enough folks in their churches ended up turning on the pastor who reported it that the environment became so hostile that the female pastor felt like she had to leave her position. The details of these vary, but these stories of being stalked or whistleblowers being attacked are very real. And what especially troubles me is that I'm not clear on if there are any consequences for the congregations. So I would say the need for whistleblower protections and protocols is great in our denomination right now. And I'm going to read a quote from one of these women. I have nothing left to lose. I've lost it all. I've lost my ministry, my vocation. I've lost my setting for being able to care for people, walk with people in these really hard, challenging places of life. And that's my strength. That's what my heart is. That's what I do. And yes, I just had all of that taken from me because she reported sexual abuse. So, next steps. Oftentimes, supporting women in ministry is treated as important, but not urgent. But when I was hearing story after story, every woman in ministry I interviewed had a story of being mistreated in ministry because she's a woman. It made me realize that supporting women in ministry is both important and very urgent. Folks love their jobs. They want to keep their jobs, as we've shown. They just don't want to get harassed at their jobs. And they want, if they are mistreated, they want it to be taken seriously. I kept coming back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. When pastors say they're struggling, it's vitally important that we diagnose the situation accurately and recognize they may be broken and bloodied on the side of the road. When I first became conference minister, there was a woman in my conference who was struggling with her pastoral ministry for the first half year of my work. And I really tried to support her, but she ended up leaving. And I apologized to her when she left that I wasn't sure what else I could do, but I do wish I had done more. I keep that at the forefront of my mind. I do not want to be the priest or the Levite walking past when somebody is hurting on the side of the road. These religious leaders, right, who may be great listening ears, but functionally walk past. don't do enough. It can be so easy for that to happen to leaders, who have good intentions at any level that they are walking past functionally, which is why I'm convinced that I can do better and that we as a denomination can do better to support women in ministry. So the good news, because that was heavy right there, the good news is that change is afoot in our denomination structurally, and I want to affirm that. So, change, here we go. So MCUSA and MC Canada are restructuring. So you've probably heard, you may have gotten the email recently that denominational minister for congregant safety is a new role, and that Nancy Kaufman is going to be the interim in that role, which is fantastic. And so that is a national role that folks can report to when there's mistreatment. And then there's going to be conference safety liaisons, I hear, which will be kind of at the conference level to help respond to reports of mistreatment. And then policies are being revamped. So there's misconduct policies, there's workplace policies that are changing right now. I've actually been part of a team that's revamping misconduct policies, and so that has felt like really good, meaningful work. And I hear that there are going to be more MCOSA trainings maybe coming out. I'll let other people speak to that. And I know AMBS just came out with a whole fleet of trainings that address some of these things. But at the same time, I would argue from all of this that much more work is needed. And I hesitate to give really specific recommendations for this because, of course, what I would suggest for a woman in a rural church to do to help keep herself safe would be different than what I would ask Glenn Guyton to do. And yet it takes thousands of people doing thousands of small actions to help change a culture and change the tides on anything. So to be effective, organizations, of course, must work for equity on multiple fronts. And so I'm going to share a list of areas that churches or conferences can take a look at if they want to be more hospitable to women in ministry, and just name that it's important to not just do one or two of these, but to work on all of them. So the first would be harnessing the leadership will to make changes. So for example, what will it take to make sure that women in leadership is always well funded, that they don't feel like they have to ask or beg for funding, right? Maybe even hire someone. What would that take? I don't know. Just ask it. Addressing organizational culture. So acknowledging that we are up against a lot of both history and modern day injustice, right? More churches in the world today think women should not be ministers than think women should be ministers. And so it takes intentionality to change cultures. For example, asking the question in your organization, how many formal or informal boys clubs are there in my organization?
Yeah, and even looking beyond aspects of organizational culture that are explicitly gendered, to look more broadly at how like a congregation or conference is functioning and making sure that it's functioning in a healthy way that can enable pastors of all genders to flourish.
Another one is HR policies and practices. So I'm really grateful for some of the changes coming out right now on the national level, like family leave. That's huge for, women really cite that as an important one. But there's more to be done, especially at the local level. Local leaders, like the church board, often don't even realize that they are kind of the first responders for a complaint of harassment. They're usually not HR professionals. They may not even be trained. And so having more training and awareness for kind of that level of leadership is important.
Yeah, and also as the quantitative results suggested, potentially having a liaison or a pastor-congregation relations team, if that's not available, could be beneficial as well as making sure that if you are a conference minister, that you do have your pastor's backs when things go wrong.
Another one, of course, is leadership development. So, developing women leaders to bring their full selves to their roles, not just needing to act like men to try to make it to the top or something. It makes a difference if women are well represented at all levels of leadership, as our studies show. And then promote theology and ideology that is not oppressive and that is overtly, anti-patriarchal and promoting women in leadership in all sorts of ways. And I will give a shout out to this book in particular, Creating Cultures of Belonging. I drew some of these categories from that and it has lots of helpful advice for specifically Christian organizations to do a better job at having equitable workplaces. And then another one, Micro-Intervention Strategies, is another book. So this is if you're having microaggressions against you, or if you're trying to be an ally, this is a way to, it says what you can do to disarm and dismantle individual and systemic racism and bias. It's focused on racism, but of course it applies to any other ism.
Okay, and I will be pretty quick, since I know that we want to get to Q&A at this point. However, there will be further research and reporting, because I have another 2 years left of my dissertation, so you're not rid of me yet. So some of the further analyses that we're excited about that I want to give you a little foreshadowing about are, for one of them, an interdenominational comparison, because my research is actually not just on MCUSA. I've also been interviewing Episcopal clergywomen, because as you highlighted, hierarchy is really important to how these things happen, and they operate in a very different way from MCUSA in terms of that. So hopefully at a future Minicon, I will be able to talk not just about MCUSA, but also about how we compare to our brothers and sisters in the Episcopal Church and siblings. We also have a bunch of data from the survey that I'm really excited about on perpetrators and settings, because we asked follow-up questions for each recent or severe instance of harm about, who did this, where did this happen, which I'm excited to analyze, because I think that knowing, did an offensive comment happen during worship? Did it happen at Menocon? Was it from another pastor in a private meeting? I think that knowing those kinds of things are very important, so we can know how to intervene in those situations and make pastors less at risk of experiencing them. We also have a lot of data both from the survey and from interviews about adaptations and resilience and people's responses to harm. Women are creative and brilliant, and there are all of these ways that they make it work and that they respond in instances of harm that we weren't able to talk about today, but that are very interesting. And we also have data about people's hopes for the future and the changes that they would like to see in MCUSA that we hope to share going forward.
So in the coming months, you will be able to access a document of major findings, because I do not have 2 years left on this project. And so I'm going to be sharing some of my major findings at this stage in the work. And so that will be, the plan is, with Cami over here, is that will be on MCUSA's website under the Women in Leadership, that it will have its own little section. And then Elizabeth especially is going to go the academic publications route. I may pitch articles some places on specific topics, and of course there's so much we couldn't get to. And then Cami says that hopefully we can do an MCUSA webinar at some point that could open this up to the nation. And then we are open to the possibility of sharing in additional spaces. I'll be going full-time as a conference minister, so this will be my side volunteer work. But yes, approach us if you want to hear more. And then on the next slide, we're going to have a way that you can sign up. So this QR code is just your basic information, where as more things come out, we will just notify people who have signed up, and people are signing up now. Thank you. That makes us feel good. So as you're doing that, I'm gonna say thanks to a few folks, key people, and then we're gonna take Q&A before we finish this morning. So I want to say thank you to the funders that we mentioned at the beginning of this project, and thanks to fellow leaders in Mountain States Mennonite Conference, especially Ryan Coe, the moderator, who saw this project as complementary, not competitive with my day job. That was really important for me to be able to do this. Thanks to MCUSA staff who encouraged this work throughout, especially Sue and Lorraine and Cami and Michael. Thank you so much. Thanks especially to each of the women who we interviewed as part of this, and to everyone who participated in the nationwide survey. It was truly an honor to be entrusted with your stories. Thank you so much.